Good afternoon. My name is Shira Newman. I'm the coordinator of arts programming here at the Rady Jewish Community Center. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 2022 edition of Music and Mavens. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Babs Asper Center for Cultural Arts, the Asper Foundation, the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg, Winnipeg Arts Council, United Way, Manitoba Arts Council, the Lampe Family Fund, Winnipeg Free Press, Jewish Post and News, Classic 107, and our individual donors for your financial support and commitment to our 2022 Music and Mavens series. The Rady Jewish Community Center is located on Treaty Number 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Before we start with today's presentation, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. One, while we anticipate there will be no technical issues during our presentation, please remember this is live, and despite our best efforts, we may have some glitches and we'll work swiftly to correct any unforeseen issues. Two, we will be taping today's session and we'll make it available for viewing on the Rady Jewish Community Music and Mavens YouTube channel. I'd also like to let everyone know that the concert portion of Music and Mavens will be starting on February 22nd and will be live and in person. For more information on this exciting series of daytime performances, please check out our website at radyjcc.com. Thank you very much. And now I will turn things over to Carla Burbreyer, Music and Mavens.
And I'm just okay, we're being recorded now, everybody. So welcome to Music and Mavens. It's so wonderful to see so many people here, so many new names and some that are quite familiar. I also wanted to mention that although it's probably a good idea to be muted during the time that the speaker is presenting, you're more than welcome to leave your screens on. This particular speaker loves to see faces. So I'm going to mention that right now. If those of you that feel comfortable turning your screens on, please do so. I'm going to tell you a little bit about today's speaker. Dr. Radhika Desai is professor at the Department of Political Studies, director, Geopolitical Economy Research Group, University of Manitoba, convener of the International Manifesto Group, and is in her third term as president of the Society for Socialist Studies. She is currently working on a book on the capitalism's post-pandemic future. Interested. The range of her work is wide, covering party politics, political and geopolitical economy, political and economic theory, nationalism, British, American, and Indian politics. Her approach is historical and based on political economy. Dr. Desai also writes for newspapers and magazines, and her work has been published in The Guardian, The Hindu, Frontline, the Winnipeg Free Press, Canadian Dimension, China Global Television Network, and other outlets. Her topic for today is Historic Crisis and Protest in Indian Agriculture, Whither, India. Welcome to Music and Mavens, Dr. Radhika Desai.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you so much, Shira. This is really great, and thanks everybody for coming. So I have about 30 to 40 minutes during which I'll speak, and then I look forward to questions and answers. Thanks also to my students and at least one colleague who I see is here, which is fantastic. So let me just get right down to business as time is short and there is so much to say. Overall, I just want to start by saying that the farmers' movements that ended last December, after a little over a year of surrounding Delhi and blockading Delhi with their protests and protest camps and so on, to me it represents a historic turning point in the politics of India. And so I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about why I think so and what I hope will happen in the coming future. And I should also, before I continue, let me also underline that if you can at all turn your videos on, I'd be really grateful. It's nice to see faces. Okay. Let me continue. So in outline, I want to give you a little bit of the background to the present situation, particularly the rise of authoritarian and something that I've called fascist government, fascist forces in government in India today. So I'm going to introduce that first as the background, because it gives you an idea of what the farmers were up against. Then I want to talk about the 3 farm laws and some of the key facts regarding that, why they were so threatening to farmers, where the strength of the farmers' protests lay and what their victory means. And then I will end by talking a little bit about where we might expect things to go in the coming months and years. So broadly speaking, what we have seen in India is a broad shift, like, just as we have seen in Canada, for example, the shift from, sort of the pre-1970s and 1980s era of a more broad-based prosperity, egalitarian politics, etc., to neoliberal politics with the rise of the right and so on. Similarly, we have also witnessed in India a general rise in right-wing politics since the late 1960s. And interestingly enough, they included at the time farmers' movements who were pitted against the attempt by the state to regulate the farm sector in a more egalitarian direction, which then put the state and the Congress government at that time on a kind of a collision course with the relatively more prosperous farmers of India. And I just want to show you, just to give you an idea of the sort of forces that the government was up against. This is not from the 60s, but from a decade later, from the late 70s, a massive rally held in the heart of Delhi by this leader, Ms. Chaudhry Charan Singh, who is, who is to be saluted for his sensitivity to farmers' issues, but the politics of farmers were not always, they were sort of in the middle, as in fact, generally peasant politics are, because peasant politics is, tied to the land. They want to preserve their private ownership of the land. And of course, once you have a division between rich farmers, landless laborers, and various layers in between, you also have a class politics around farmers' politics. But anyway, this shows you, and it also demonstrates another thing, which is that in India, where about 47% of the labor force still remains engaged in agriculture, there is also a town versus country dimension to politics, which you saw here. And movements like this were part of the decline of the Congress party, which I'll talk about later, because essentially these were the sorts of people who gave the Congress party its electoral heft in the countryside. And once they became dissatisfied with Congress politics, they began leaving Congress in large numbers and began creating first farmers' movements like this, and then later on what I will call regional parties, or what I call initially, parties that were originally based in the relatively prosperous farmers and then came to be based in what I now call the provincial property classes. So this move to the right accompanied creeping marketization of India's economic policies, including in agriculture. Although the more formal phase of neoliberalism in India is generally dated to the 1990s, you already see a certain creeping marketization of India's policies, because the whole strategy of planned development that was adopted in the post-independence period essentially proved to be something that the Congress did not have the political capacity to carry out. In the from the late 1980s onwards, part of this right-wing advance included Hindutva's political party, which was called the Bharatiya Janata Party. And since that time, it has emerged as the most powerful force on the right in Indian politics. Today, of course, it is in power. And for the first time since the late 1980s, it has formed a single-party majority government. Not because it's, so widely popular, partly because it's bankrolled by the biggest corporations of India, and because of the first past the post electoral system, which allows it to translate the votes of roughly 25% of the Indian electorate into a thumping majority in parliament. So this Hindu right began to advance through a combination of appeal to the middle classes and communal politics. I tried to use an expression that would be more familiar to you, but I think I must use the word communal politics in India, because it's the politics of religious communities. And in the case of the Hindu right, it tends to marginalize primarily India's very substantial Muslim minority, which is about 15% of India's population. So it's fairly substantial, although you will also have read frequently about how it has targeted Christian minorities in India, including priests and so on. So there's a neoliberal appeal to middle classes and also this kind of communal polarization. And the roots of this politics lies in a formation which in India is called the Sangh Parivar, which is meant the Sangh family. The word Sangh refers to the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, which roughly translated means something as innocuous as National Volunteer Force, but it was created in the 1920s explicitly on the inspiration of Mussolini's fascism. And it has always been about Hindu politics. And I've got here a link. I'm not going to obviously take you through this, but I guess this is going to be a little bit less easy than I thought, but let me see if I can get, yeah, this is the one, share this. So if you can see this, I just want to draw your attention very briefly to, this is a Wikipedia entry on it. And here you see the Sangh Parivar members. And you can see just how many different organizations there are as part of the family of organizations that is the Sangh Parivar. And here is also an incomplete list on the bottom right here of the overseas organizations, which means that these forces exist here in Winnipeg as they do in other parts of the other places where there are Indian emigres. Okay, so to return to this, so this is the Sangh Parivar, and as I say, the most influential organizations of emigre Indians are actually Hindutva organizations. They systematically tend to exclude Indian Muslims and often also Indian Dalits, that is to say Indian untouchables, Harijans, whatever you want to call them, the lowest castes, etc. The original advance of these groups was based on a broad-based alliance of the upper and middle castes and classes. Now I could talk about, for hours about just this point, but just for now, take my word for it. And this included the prosperous farmers, and this wave of the rise of Hindutva politics culminated in the coalition governments led by the former leader of the BJP, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, from 1998 to 2004. And this was the result of the three main key developments that I've traced, and I've been writing about Indian elections, written about every major Indian elections right up from 2004 to 2019. So I've developed this framework for understanding it. So these three developments are the long-term decline of the Congress party as these rural links, these rural bases of the Congress party leave the Congress party. So it has experienced a long-term decline. The rise of the parties of what I call the provincial property classes, and the rise of Hindutva. And briefly, what do I mean by provincial property classes? Essentially, they have their roots in the countryside, and they become what we may call an agricultural capitalist class, and a class of well-to-do farmers gets transformed into a broader provincial elite, which is no longer specifically rooted in agriculture, because once they become sufficiently better off, they diversify their investments into other fields. So the noted civil rights activist K. Balagopal described it like this back in the late 1980s. He said a typical family of this class has a land holding in its native village, cultivated by hired laborers, bataidars, which are sharecroppers, and tenants or farm servants, and supervised by the father or one son. Business of various descriptions in towns, whether in trade, finance, hotels, cinemas, and contracts managed by other sons, and perhaps a young bright child who is a doctor or an engineer, and may even be a professor at one of the small university towns that have, a small town university, sorry, that has sprouted up all over the country. So this gives you a kind of sociological image of what we are talking about. So essentially, up to this point, Hindutva advanced in coalition with these classes. And I say that these were either social coalitions, in which meant that these types of these social layers directly joined the party of Hindutva, or they were explicitly political coalitions where these forces created regional parties, what I call parties of the provincial property classes. And then they, along with Hindutva party, the BJP, created coalition governments at the state level. And of course, between 1998 and 2004, you saw this phenomena at the federal level as well. So again, just to give you a visual image, I've got two charts here. This is of seats and of votes. And let's just take the vote category for now. You know, in Indian elections, there are hundreds of political parties that compete. So if one tried to analyze the political parties you know, the individual political parties, one would be bewildered by the sheer variety of things you had to take into account. But what you see here is the decline of Congress party, which is represented by this blue line, the rise of the parties of the provincial property classes, which is represented by this green line, and then the rise of the parties of the right, which is primarily the Hindu BJP party, which is represented by the orange line. So to continue, essentially the 2004, between 98 and 2004, the BJP led a coalition. And after that, their coalition was defeated. And for a decade, India was ruled by a Congress-led coalition. So by this time, Congress had declined sufficiently to essentially lead to a situation in which it could not also create a single-party government. It ruled in coalition. And thanks to the power of the CPM, the left parties in it, it actually forced on the Congress certain progressive policies, particularly policies related to providing employment and income to the poorest families in India, which actually did lead to considerable economic progress and advance in that period. But since that time, from 2014, the Modi government has been in power. And so what you now have, however, since 2014 is actually a very new formation in which the Modi government is in power on its own. It has created, as I said, the first single party majority government ever. And it has been able to do so because it's been bankrolled by India's corporate class. It has been boosted by blatant and overwhelming media partisanship. As I say, it was elected by only about 25% of the electorate. And it has also gained because Congress in particular keeps imagining that it's going to come back to power on its own and therefore does not engage in coalition building with the parties of the provincial property classes. There's more to say here, but I won't. And this Modi government over the past 7 years has presided over some of the most disastrous policies ever. You all heard of demonetization in 2016 when suddenly banknotes over a certain denomination were withdrawn from circulation in the name of tackling corruption, and it imposed a massive economic crisis in India. Of course, systematic privatization, anti-labor laws, anti-farmer laws, which we'll talk about more in a minute, high inflation, high unemployment, and divisive politics, the politics of implementing the so-called Citizenship Amendment Act, which would have essentially required or essentially made anyone liable to be accused of not being Indian. And of course, in the present context, what that means is that Muslims could simply be identified as aliens just at the drop of a hat, unless they were able to produce a very long list of documents. And also, of course, some of you will remember that the special status of Kashmir, India's only majority Muslim state, was abrogated, was removed from the constitution. And today Kashmir is ruled by via president's rule. So there is no democracy in Kashmir and an enormous amount of repression going on there. So Modi alienated, so this kind of what I call very pro-corporate rule has managed to alienate even farmers and middle classes, because the Modi government is so biased in favor of the biggest corporation. I mean, this is crony capitalism, crony corporate capitalism writ large, because essentially the Modi government has no serious economic policy other than doing the bidding of the biggest business houses. So over the past several years, the Modi government has faced a groundswell of opposition, protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, a huge general strike which happened just around the time when the farmers' protest began in November 2020, and of course then the year-long farmers' protest. But there has also been another really remarkable phenomenon. Sorry, I think there's a misprint here. So if you're reading this, please ignore what it says in this last point, but just follow what I'm saying, which is that the Modi government has steadily lost its, or let me rephrase that. The BJP has steadily lost state governments. That is to say, its ability to win elections at the state level has been massively hampered. And I have this little chart that shows you this. So I found this on the web, which just shows you all the orange colored states were ruled by the BJP in 2017. And by 2019, this had shrunk quite considerably. And what you see here now is the present situation where you can see that, yes, it has regained Karnataka. So that's one big gain, but it has lost Rajasthan. It has lost Maharashtra, two huge states. And it has regained Madhya Pradesh, this middle one here, simply because it was able to engineer a defection on the part of certain MPs. So you can see that if this trend continues, the BJP's hold over India will get less and less sure. And at the moment, we are looking at elections in 5 major states, which includes, by the way, India's most populous state, which is Uttar Pradesh, which is this state. And winning and losing this state can make and break governments. And it's very likely that the present BJP-ruled government will lose the election. But there are elections in UP, also in Punjab, important for the farmers' movement, in Uttarakhand, and then in 2 smaller states of Manipur and Goa. And the results are expected on the 10th of March. So now I can tell you a little bit about the farmers movement. So essentially, there were these 3 farmers' laws. Okay, the names are up here: the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act, and these 2 other acts. So the first one essentially removed what remains of the infrastructure that provided minimum support prices for some farmers, chiefly in Punjab and Haryana, for wheat and rice, and it leaves farmers to the mercy of powerful, often fraudulent corporate buyers, and undermines India's food security. So that was the overall meaning of this act. The second act essentially expanded contract farming, which is a way of uploading the benefits, I should say, to corporations and downloading the inevitably great risks to the farmer. And it was a way of essentially to shift India from the production of essential crops to cash crops. And this is a very big difference. You know, the first world countries particularly, and by the way, the Western media, like the Indian middle class media, is totally in favor of these laws. They would really love to see most of the tropical world produce all those tropical things which Western countries cannot produce on their own land, or certainly cannot produce them in the winter. So that Western countries can have strawberries in the middle of winter and shrimp whenever they like, and so on. But this kind of transformation of Indian agriculture would leave Indians without essential food crops. The West always says, no, we will supply you with grain, etc., because we are so, capable of producing grain. But that would not, no matter how much the grain all the Americas could supply, would be enough to supply India if Indian farmers stop producing grain. And I'll show you an interesting chart about that later. And then finally, there was the Essential Commodities Act. With diminishing government procurement and minimum support prices, the system that feeds the public distribution system, this system would be abrogated, and that would reduce, the public distribution system has historically reduced without eliminating hunger and malnutrition in India. So you would see a great deal of that. And by the way, the statistics for hunger and malnutrition were already bad before the pandemic. They have gotten even worse today. So essentially what these farm laws were doing was they were essentially seeking to dismantle the supportive agricultural regime, the dismantling that began in the 1990s by deregulating input prices, essential inputs such as electricity, fertilizer, fuel, etc., subsidies of all sorts, the rising cost of production across the board, decline in public support, increasing corporatization and contract farming, including, by the way, the admission of big corporations to provide seeds. We've seen that in Canada as well, where farmers have protested against these corporate seeds, which cannot be reused for sowing again, and so on. You have to buy every lot of seeds anew from these corporations. You also have heard of a lot of farmers' suicides in India, and those suicides are very much due to these trends. That corporatization also led to the heavy indebting of the farm sector, which also led to a lot of suicides. A rise in fuel and fertilizer prices, rise in insurance premia, reductions in subsidies, land acquisition, increasingly land acquisition for urban development and for industrial development from farmers with various levels of coercion has been a huge issue for farmers. And also, of course, after a spike in the late 2000s, we've also had relatively low food prices for a long time, although they are rising again now. And finally, the increasing dismantling of the public distribution system, whose operation also gave the government a big incentive to keep up certain support prices and so on. So these are the things that have been happening, and this undermines what remains. The laws undermine what remains of the minimum support price regime. The government grabbed the opportunity to ram through legislation in the middle of the pandemic, thinking that it would face no opposition. And of course, it is in favor of pro-corporate agribusiness, not even the rich farmers. So what's really interesting about the farmers' protest is that rich farmers were there in very big numbers. Not all rich farmers, as I'll explain in a minute, but they were there in very big numbers. And of course, it was against the poorer farmers, but this was also felt by the relatively well-to-do farmers. It also violated federalism. And it empowered bureaucracy against elected officials, and it exposed farmers to corporate fraud. And all of these laws will do nothing to alleviate India's scandalous levels of hunger and malnutrition. Indeed, there are huge government stocks, and they are used actually to put downward pressure on agricultural prices, which of course is not good for farmers. So the farmers began protesting these laws. And also they were protesting other measures that had been initiated by the government. So to clean up the air of Delhi, farmers were essentially pointed to is, you are burning stubble and this is creating bad air quality, etc. Whereas this is an important part, the burning of stubble is an important part of the capacity of these farmers to take several crops a year. People don't realize that tropical land is actually far more productive than temperate land, because here you can take one crop a year. In India, you can take 2-3 crops a year. And this is very important for Indian farmers to be able to do that. So the effect, as I say, is well, I won't go through this next lot of effects, but essentially the farmers' tempo began in the summer of 2020, and then the tempo began increasing. And by November, there was this big Delhi Chalo, means let's go to Delhi campaign. And there had been encampments for the next year around the main highways that ran into Delhi. There were numerous attempts to try to discredit these farmers' movements, particularly one where an incident where some elements that were not connected with farmers' movements engaged in certain miscreant behavior during the January 26th, that is to say, Republic Day events. And this created a major crisis, where people tried to use these events as a way of saying, you've got to go back, you can't stay here anymore. And the farmers went through, they essentially decided to stay, the leaders decided to stay. One even broke down in front of television cameras saying, this is just a conspiracy to discredit us, we are not moving. And somehow just watching that on television screens managed to make farmers feel that, okay, we are going to stay, we will stay. So what's interesting about this farmers movement is the vast majority of farmers' unions across the country have supported this movement. They have created a larger organization called the Samyukta Kisan Morcha, or the United Farmers Front. So they have support of these farmers unions. They have support of the vast majority of trade unions, caste organizations, and nearly all the political parties that are opposed to Hindutva. So only a small number of organizations of the richer farmers oppose this. but they are really not very much on the scene. So what's really interesting as well is that there is a cross-class alliance. Interestingly, organizations of landless labor also supported the farmers, although normally they are pitted against each other as employers versus employees, etc. And that included untouchable or Dalit workers, women, etc. So essentially, there has been an enormous amount of support. I won't go into some of the other details. So what have they achieved? Essentially, their dedication managed to force an arrogant government, a government that is normally used to getting its own way, force this government to shift its position. And this was a historic achievement on the part of the farmers' movement. Because if you consider what they were up against, it was an enormous amount. They were up against the most authoritarian regime India has ever seen, one that is run by a fascist party, backed by a vast family of fascist organizations, all of whom were working overtime to try to defeat the farmers. A prime minister who has won 2 single-party majority governments back-to-back for the first time since 1984. That was the last time a single-party majority government was elected in India. It was up against a powerful corporate capitalist class, the most powerful, I would say, of any third world country. And that was the corporate capitalist class that put the present government in power and essentially regards him as their agent, their man in New Delhi, so to speak. An Indian middle and professional class that is absolutely in love with Modi, Hindutva, etc., etc. A media that is completely devoted to the Hindutva agenda. And I'm not exaggerating. There is hardly any media outlets that did not question, apart from a few, a handful, that did not fundamentally question the farmers' protests. And the complete failure of any serious left opposition to essentially take up their cause. So they said, okay, we are going to have our own movement. And they have fought this with, so obviously their opposition to the 3 odious laws, which would have had all these deleterious effects on them. But they have shown a remarkable ability to organize, where they have used all the modern means of communication, but they have also mobilized traditional caste-based networks, so that they have, as I say, combined both the traditional means and modern means in order to put forward a remarkable level of resilience and a remarkable organizational capacity to keep these camps going throughout a whole year, when, as you will know, if you're a farmer, you have seasonal demands on your time, and they managed to keep enough people there throughout this whole period while not neglecting their farms. So they were therefore also determined, and they, as I say, for all their other differences, there was no political party opposed to the BJP that was not enthusiastically in support of the farmers. And finally, there was another very important thing the farmers did. They managed to create a secular unity between Hindus and Muslims in particular. And this is very, very important. If you understand the extent to which Hindus have been mobilized to support BJP merely on some sort of a completely stupid anti-Muslim platform. I mean, you wouldn't believe, I suppose I should say that in a certain sense, the hatred of Muslims in India it's very remarkable. I mean, it's a bit like racism. It's a bit like anti-Semitism of the worst days and perhaps today as well. But really, it's far worse than that, because it can be openly expressed in polite society, and very few people will challenge you. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my presentation. So I just want to emphasize one thing, that this victory is crucial. Sorry about that. Alan, this victory is crucial not just for India's food security, but for the world's food security. So just let's take a look at this table, which I don't have, unfortunately, a more recent one. It refers to prices prevailing in the early 90s, but I still think it's relevant. So, the situation in early 90s. So here what you have is the food dependence of some selected first world countries. So you can see, for example, that in different categories of food types, first world countries are very, very food dependent. So, you know, they import a very large proportion of their food. So you can see here, right? Whereas in the case of India, it is remarkably low. India imports hardly any food. If you essentially transformed Indian agriculture in such a way that India was to produce cash crops and then, you know, not produce food, the amount of food India would require to import would either lead to India may not be able to import it at prevailing prices, which would mean there would be a huge malnutrition in India, hunger and malnutrition in India, or India would be able to import it, in which case there would be a vast spike in food prices. Because it is this production and consumption of food in India by Indians that accounts for the fact that India does not really enter into and therefore does not disturb the world food market very much. Okay, so where are we going? Where is India going? So essentially the question is, will this farmers' movement be able to galvanize genuine popular opposition for a fairer, more secular, that is not divided by religion, more equal and more democratic India? I really hope so. I really hope that the next election results that we will get on March the 10th will show that that is the direction in which we are going. But there are also some other considerations to bear in mind. Number one, the farmers' movement has not been able to galvanize the creation of a nationwide coalition, a coalition between the Congress, the left, and all these parties of the provincial property classes that I talked about. This has not yet happened. So, but at the same time, the states at various levels may continue to pass out of BJP control. The farmers' movements themselves have had a few divisions. Some farmers' organizations have wanted to contest the elections. Others have said, do not contest the election. Just appeal to people to vote for parties that are not the BJP, to oppose the BJP, etc. So we will see which strategy has won and so on. And I expect that as soon as the elections are over, because these elections are quite important, they are taking place in two of the agriculturally very important areas. What we will see is that after the elections are over in March, by mid-March and so on, we will see the farmers returning to their remaining demands, which remain quite substantial. What they have achieved is the repeal of the 3 laws. Now, they still want the legal right to minimum support prices for all major agricultural crops. They want the restoration of the public distribution system. They want the implementation of a major report written on Indian agriculture, which contains many critically important recommendations. The Swaminathan report, which would take Indian agriculture in the right direction. So that's what they are demanding. They are demanding the withdrawal of certain electricity legislation that requires them to pay high prices for electricity. They, of course, want any charges laid against farmers during the protests to be withdrawn. They want the dismissal from the Modi cabinet of a certain minister whose son was actually filmed driving into farmers, protesting farmers. And additionally, they want the union government to announce compensation for those who died during the protest as well. So I guess I will just conclude by saying, really, what all this shows us is that what Indian agriculture needs, and which is a vast part of world agriculture, what it needs is a more state-supportive strategy, not neoliberalism, not corporatization, etc. It needs more state support to small farmers. It needs minimum support prices, extension services, land reform, ecological management, etc. So these are the things Indian farmers really need, and they have not been getting for decades. And the farmers' protest represented the culmination of these processes. So I will end there, and hopefully we will have questions and answers.
Okay, wow, thank you, Radhika. There's so much information to take in there. And I think what I'm going to do is I see that there have been some comments that are sent through, but there's one specifically from Mikhail. I'm not sure where you are, Mikhail, that, yes, okay, that wanted to ask you directly, not send a question to me. And I think that, Mikhail, if you would like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Well, first, thank you, Radhika, for the lecture. That was really interesting.
Thanks for coming, Mikhail. It took me a while, but now, of course, I recognize you. It's wonderful to see you. Yes.
Yeah, a pleasure. I did have a question, though. I mean, one thing that's been preoccupying my mind, I suspect probably a lot of people's minds these days, has been the protests in Canada. And one thing that's really been bothering me on a certain level is how it struck me that it seems the response from the powers that be is very, very different to this kind of a protest than, say, some of the protests we've seen led by Indigenous groups and more marginalized groups. And that got me thinking about what you were saying about how there were rich farmers involved in these protests. I was wondering, to the extent that that was the case, did it elicit a different reaction from the authorities? Do you think that, was there any evidence, that there was less brutality, less of an aggressive response insofar as the more privileged people in that society, if you want to call them that, were present?
Sure.
Is that clear?
Sorry, are you done?
Yes, sorry.
Carla, shall I reply or shall I?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a really great question. And I want to say a couple of things about it. So first of all, one of the things that I should have perhaps emphasized more, but there are so many things to say, but the farmers' movements have dealt with extremely repressive state response. Okay, so there's no doubt, water cannon, tear gas, blockades, you name it, they have been dealt with quite harshly. That's the first point. The second point is that, what you say reminds me, like I also wondered when I saw these protests, whether they had taken any inspiration from the farmers blockading of India. And let me tell you one other thing. There's no way of corroborating it, but I suspect that you see, in 1992, Hindu militants essentially broke down, like it attacked and it dismantled with handheld tools, an ancient mosque in Ayodhya. You will remember this, some of you will remember this. And that occurred within a few weeks after the Berlin Wall was brought down by similar means. And that occurred. So the first attempt to do this was in 1989, a few weeks after the Berlin Wall was brought down by similar means. So I think that when you live in an age of 24-hour, 24/7 world news with images being cast around, I think that to some extent, these things will happen. And yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I was myself saying to some friends the other day that, when you had in fact, it was reported that Mr. Trudeau has ruled out bringing out the army. And that this has been done only twice before. And which are the two occasions? The FLQ crisis and Oka. So, we will bring out the army against Quebec, we will bring out the army against Indigenous people, but not against these folks. So we can draw our own conclusions, I'm not saying that the army should be, I have not studied the matter closely enough for me to say whether we should bring out the army, but it is amazing the kid gloves with which these protesters are being treated. And I feel particularly alarmed when I read also, or I hear on the radio, that some police forces are actually expressing sympathy with these people rather than imposing the law on them. So there are a whole bunch of things to think about here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the answer.
Thank you, Mikhail, for raising that. I see there's a comment from Andrea that thanking you for your engaging and interesting presentation as well, Radhika. I wanted to bring up the comment that you made about the farmers succeeding in secular unity between the Hindus and the Muslims. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that, the depth of that huge division in India for some of the people that really aren't aware of how deep that is.
Right. So this would again require an enormous amount of reflection. But let me just say the following. I could talk for a long time about, anybody could talk for a long time about that. So, in India, Hindus and Muslims have been living side by side in India for centuries. Okay, and there are hardly any. There is no evidence of serious clashes between Hindus and Muslims, apart from isolated ones, ever until British rule arrived. Okay, and so there is this narrative, which I think has a substantial amount of truth in it, in which we said that the British really began pitting Hindus against Muslims. The second thing is as well that both Hindus and Muslims in India are very regionally diverse. A Kashmiri Muslim has very little in common with a Keralite Muslim, and so on. So, and similarly Hindus. I mean, as you know, some people have argued that there is no such thing as Hinduism. There is, only a very wide diversity of faiths and traditions and so on. So it has been part of and of course, what people very often, ages ago, I wrote this essay, which I published now under a different title, but humorously, I entitled it Huggable Hinduism and Hateful Hindutva. So everybody thinks Hinduism is such a cute, nice religion, with its sweet gods and blah, blah, and so on. And in reality, modern Hinduism is very hard to differentiate from Hindutva. So actually, it would be as though the entire church, say, imagine that there was one Christianity and the entire church was essentially hand in glove with a fascist force. Okay, and now this is the context in which what you have now. Now, the other point I would like to make is that, of course, thanks to the divisions that were sown during British rule in India, and thanks also, I would say, to Indian leaders, that is to say the predominantly Hindu leaders of India, including Gandhi and Nehru, thanks to their refusal to agree to Jinnah's demand that we should have a relatively decentralized federation. That meant that the whole of what was British India could remain united in a single country. Nehru and Gandhi refused this. And that is why you got partition. Partition is always blamed on Jinnah, but that's not why you got Jinnah's demand. Jinnah did not want partition. He just said, please give me a decentralized federation or else. And they said, okay, off you go. And so they created this, astonishing country with two territories far apart, separated by British India. Eventually, of course, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. If India had not been divided, India would have been the largest Muslim country in the world by far. To right now, Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country, and India, Pakistan, Bangladesh follow very closely after. But it would have been almost 3 times as big as Indonesia. And with a far more substantial Muslim minority, there would have been no room for Hindutva to develop. So I guess I can just sort of skirt around it in these ways, just to give you an idea. And finally, I can only say that I find it shocking, the level of prejudice against Muslims that you hear on a regular basis in polite society. And I mean by that, not just, traditional India, but the most elite westernized Indians who are having their cocktail parties and what have you will express this because there is nobody to oppose them. On the whole, they socialize with other relatively high caste Hindus. And I will say one final thing in closing. Really, in India, the predominantly Hindu upper caste is also the predominantly overrepresented as the upper class, the ruling class. It is a high caste ruling class. And then some relatively well-to-do middle castes have joined them. But basically, it's an upper and middle class caste coalition that excludes a very substantial majority of people who, if they made common cause, nothing could stop them. Who are they? They are the lower middle castes, the lower castes, the indigenous population of India, which are called Adivasis in India, which literally mean the early settlers, the original settlers, and finally, the Muslims and other religious minorities. If these people could coalesce together for a progressive politics, nothing could stop them. But this is not happening. There's even a word for it. It's called Bahujan Samaj. You can try to create such a coalition. And if this were to happen, nothing could stop them, but it's not yet happening. It's, I could say more about this, but I hope this gives you some idea of that. Yeah.
I'm going to encourage more people to send messages my way. Something that has been commented on is you mentioned about Modi and Hindutva and how much the media loves Modi and the fascists love him without any opposition. Do you see international pressure as being a method of breaking through that lack of opposition?
That's a really interesting question as well. So I would say that, Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat before he became the prime minister of India. And he became chief minister in the earliest days of his becoming chief minister, there was essentially a massacre, something I would say conforms to the UN definition of genocide, against Muslims in Gujarat in 2002. And in the aftermath of that, many Western governments barred him from visiting the UK, the US, etc. But as soon as he became prime minister, this was removed. And so he has been freely visiting all the Western capitals, etc. But I would say that, I think that if you consider the fact that the West is quite happy to ally with all sorts of right-wing forces, including extreme right forces, for instance, at the moment in Ukraine, I don't find this at all, at all difficult to believe. In fact, as I think it was Theodor Adorno who said, those who don't want to talk about capitalism should stay silent about fascism, because, there is a tendency to equate, in the West has created this post-Second World War discourse in which fascism and somehow communism are related. But the fact of the matter is this was an astonishing turnaround from a time where everybody and their dog knew that fascism and capitalism are umbilically linked, and it is not a question. So I think this is something that we forget. So basically at the moment there is hardly any opposition to Modi from Western countries. Here we are proclaiming that we are standing in favor of democracy, whereas in India journalists are being murdered, activists are being murdered in broad daylight, facing impunity. The people, nobody is caught, nobody is punished, so this can go on. I actually know at least one friend who has left India for these reasons because she might be targeted. And I had never thought I would live to see the day when that happened. I mean, yes, I know there is a retail oppression of, police, like you have some policemen, a group of policemen who think they are too good and they terrorize a few people. But this is now reaching to the levels of literally, right, if not elites, at least respectable society, like university professors and so on. And it is absolutely shocking that this should happen and that they should elicit so little response from Western countries. So.
Well, there have been protests that have seeped into Canada, as you're aware that, Toronto, not as much in Winnipeg, you don't see that as much. But do you think that by having these protests going to other North American countries and getting a grassroots opposition, there is any hope of increasing the awareness to the point that people may feel a little bit more hopeful about?
Do you mean protests against what, sorry?
Protests on behalf of the farmers,
yes,
occurring in other parts of the world outside of India.
Well, I think that, that's a really interesting point. And certainly we had a few such, I certainly spoke here in Winnipeg at such demonstrations in favor or in support of the farmers and so on. So there have been, and I think that's a very good thing. One of the things I said early on is that most of the emigre organizations, most influential emigre organizations of people who that are called Indian emigre organizations, they're actually Hindu emigre organizations. They would not have supported this, but there are also others who represent a much more progressive politics, and they are chiefly the ones who have organized actions in support of Indian farmers across the world. And I think that's been a very good thing. And interestingly, everywhere where there is a substantial Punjabi community, like the UK, for example, and here and so on, there's also been much greater protest. And I must say, part of the reason I feel hopeful is because, at the end of the day, what has happened now under Modi's pro-corporate policies is that even a number of middle-class people are beginning to feel the pinch. They realize that this is not in their favor. This is in favor of only the obscenely rich. So now they are beginning to see that they need to engage in some protests. And that is happening within India as well as beyond, because as somebody said, you know, I forget what interview I was listening to, but it was one of these farmer type protests. And he said, you know, right now there is a huge employment crisis in India. Like, you know, in Bihar, there were even riots of young people saying, you know, where are the jobs? We don't have jobs, right? So who are these people who are looking for jobs? They are, after all, the sons, you know, I mean, you know, they may be the children of these farmers. They have become educated. Now they're looking for urban jobs. They're not finding any. So in that sense, I think that because India still has, because 47% of the Indian workforce still is engaged in agriculture and related activities, the potential for support of farmers is very high. So I'm really, I mean, I think, of course, everything that can be done from outside, particularly in terms of putting pressure on the governments is you know, like governments like Canada and US and UK and so on, is good. But ultimately, of course, the fate of it, India is too big a country for its fate to be decided from outside. You know, the farmers in India are going to decide, the people in India are going to decide how this will unfold. So,
I guess another question, a corollary to that that's come up is, do you see an end to this, or is this an ongoing thing that will take many, many, many years to wrap?
That's really interesting. And I think that depends on how the farmers' movement reassembles after the elections, because I think that right now all the attention is on the election. So we will see, and the election outcome will also be interesting. You know, I think Punjab will certainly not go to the BJP, but will UP go to the BJP, etc. This will be interesting. And then we will have to see how the farmers' movement recomposes itself, what it demands, how do the rest of the political forces shape up alongside it, because right now we are in a lull. But I would say that things will not change until the Modi government is very substantially destabilized, because essentially you have to remember that when Modi accepted that he was going to withdraw the 3 laws, he basically, the position that he took is, I tried to persuade the farmers that this was in their best interests. And of course, he did not try to persuade anybody. Like the government barely met with the farmers, right? But I tried to persuade the farmers, but now, you know, they didn't agree with me. So now, sadly, I'm withdrawing these laws, which would have been so much in their favor. So he has maintained a position from which he can perhaps, you know, maybe not these laws, but some other laws, etc. Or, oh, and one thing I should mention. Yes, there is another sign that of what his strategy is going to be. In the new budget, which has just been presented, essentially the government has done nothing. It's total standstill or regression for the agricultural sector. So there is no support. Basically, he's saying to them, if you're going to oppose me, you're going to get nothing. Right? So this is what he is doing. So really, he is not going to give up without a fight, because he at the end of the day, he has won 2 elections without having to really create a support base, because he has been bankrolled enough and the opposition has been disunited enough. So the question is, how long can this strategy succeed? This is the issue. And the corporate capitalist class in India will certainly, they live in their own world. They will certainly continue bankrolling him. So the question is whether there will be a groundswell of organization of these energies that farmers' protests have shown and other protests have shown, to compose them into a real national alternative.
So we're coming close to the end of the hour, but I'm going to take just a few more questions that have popped up, Radhika. One of them is a question asking if you think this has anything to do with the human smuggling.
Oh, right. Well, I think insofar as it has anything to do with human smuggling, it is simply that Modi's policies are obviously creating a situation in which people get that desperate to leave. Because I know what you're referring to. You're referring to this family that was found frozen just near Emerson. So I think that these sorts of, well, that also gives rise to a whole range of other issues in which I would say that it's not just the smugglers, it's also the policies pursued by governments such as India, such as Canada, etc., that we have to also put in the larger picture, because on the one hand, well, anyway, I mean, this would become then a talk about migration, which I'm happy to talk about. But this is, at the moment, perhaps I should just keep myself to this, because let me just put it this way. Migration has been a central part of capitalism's development. I can practically say as an axiom, no migration, no capitalism, because capitalism today needs, all hands on deck and more besides. And where are they going to come from? You can't wait for women today to produce the next generation of kids. So migration from town to country, from one country to another, has been a central part of capitalism. So it's only, we don't see that because our leaders keep talking about how nice we are being when we admit migrants. What we don't talk about is that we need their labor. What we don't talk about is that, quite frankly, a lot of the times the migration taps are turned on in order to loosen up the labor market. So all of these things need to be discussed. So about migration. So that tragedy, which is indeed very tragic, is part of this much larger picture, which would require us to discuss a whole bunch of other things.
So I'm going to give you one last question, Radhika, because we're running right at the top of the hour here. Do you think Modi has improved international relations and image since he became Prime Minister, or do you think he has evoked feelings of strong opposition, not only locally, but also internationally?
Well, as far as the dominant discourse, both in India and abroad is concerned, I would say that Modi is generally portrayed as being having been good. So, with having, increased hostilities with Pakistan, having increased hostilities with China. This is, this is something for which he's congratulated in India. And of course, the more he does this, he's also congratulated in Western capitals. The real question is whether we have anything to gain. First of all, India could have much better relations with Pakistan. It is absolutely a travesty that India and Pakistan keep, that under Modi, their relations have deteriorated to the extent that they have. So that's one thing. Secondly, India has absolutely nothing to gain by making an enemy out of China. India has a border dispute with China. India has a border dispute with Pakistan. India has multiple border disputes with multiple countries. China also had multiple border disputes with multiple countries. But you know what? I think apart from the border dispute with India, China has peacefully settled all its border disputes with all other countries. What does that tell you about China's position vis-a-vis border disputes and India's position vis-a-vis border disputes? So I think this is something else we have to bear in mind.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And I see a question has popped up here asking if this has been recorded, and yes, it is. It will be on our Radio JCC YouTube channel as of tomorrow. I'll be sending Radhika that link, and if I see that there are some students of hers, I'm sure that you can get that link from her as well. And I wanted to thank you so much for today's super interesting and very provocative discussion, Radhika. You never disappoint. Always very passionate when I ask you to speak on Music and Maven. So thank you so much. I wanted to mention to all of you here as well that next Tuesday will be our last speaker on the Music and Maven series. And after that, as Shira mentioned at the top of the hour, we will be moving to live concerts, and we will be selling those tickets online at the radiojcc.com website. Thank you so much to all of you. I hope to see you again at other Music and Mavens events. And thank you so much, Radhika, for being such an amazing speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Carla. And thanks everyone for coming. It was really nice to speak with you and get your questions.
All right.
Bye-bye.